They say blood is thicker than water, but I'll let you in on something most families never figure out until it's too late. The real thickness of blood, it's measured in dollar signs, and the people most likely to drain you dry are the ones who share your last name. Welcome back to Family Fortunes. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the quiet ones always see everything. Drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. You're about to learn why some old men keep their money closer than their children. The thing about land is that it doesn't argue with you. It doesn't ask for loans against your inheritance or call you senile behind your back. Arthur Bellingham understood this. For 52 years, he worked a stretch of soil in rural Kentucky that most people would drive past without slowing down. His son Kenneth saw dirt. His daughter-in-law saw a future sale price. But the woman who cooked his meals, drove him to appointments, and never asked for a single thing in return, she saw something else entirely. And when the fight for Arthur's money finally came to a head, the quietest person in that house was holding a pen. Her name was Elena Massey. She was 61 years old, widowed, and had worked for Arthur Bellingham for 9 years by the time the trouble started. She cooked his meals, managed his medications, drove him to doctor's appointments in the next county, and she never asked for anything beyond her modest weekly pay. Not once. She was not a nurse, not a blood relation, not someone Kenneth Bellingham had ever bothered to learn the last name of. He called her the help when he thought Arthur couldn't hear him. Arthur heard everything. The Bellingham farm sat on 240 acres of prime Kentucky pastureland, rolling green that had been in the family since 1892. Arthur's grandfather cleared it. His father expanded it. Arthur had worked it with his own hands from the age of 14, and by the time he turned 78, those hands were gnarled and swollen with arthritis, but his mind was as sharp as the day he bought his first herd. The land, if you valued it at current market rates for the county, was worth somewhere north of $4.3 million. Kenneth had done the math. He'd done the math many times. Kenneth Bellingham was 47, lived in Louisville, worked in commercial real estate, and had visited his father exactly 3 times in the previous 2 years. Once for Christmas, briefly, because his wife Patricia wanted to be back in the city for a party. Once when he needed $15,000 to cover a bad investment he'd made without telling Patricia the full truth about. And once with a lawyer. That third visit was the one that changed everything. Arthur didn't know about the lawyer at the time because Kenneth introduced him as an old college friend doing some estate planning work in the area, just stopping by to say hello. The man's name was Douglas Creech, and he specialized in contested probate litigation. He also specialized in something called undue influence claims, which is a legal term that means convincing a judge that someone manipulated an old person into changing their financial decisions. Kenneth wasn't planning to prevent his father from changing anything. He was planning to lay the groundwork to undo whatever change his father might already have made. Now you need to understand something about Arthur Bellingham. He didn't have a computer. He didn't have a smartphone. He balanced his checkbook by hand and kept his important papers in a fireproof safe behind a loose board in the hallway closet. But the man read. He read legal periodicals, farm journals, the local paper cover to cover, and he'd spent the last 5 years watching his son with the patient, unsentimental attention of a farmer studying a coyote circling his livestock. Arthur knew what was coming. He'd known since the Christmas visit when Patricia, his daughter-in-law, had let slip at dinner that they'd been talking to someone about long-term care options. Arthur had no need of long-term care. He was still driving, still negotiating with suppliers, still making repairs on the property with Elena's help. But Patricia had spoken as if the decision was already half made, as if Arthur's role was simply to cooperate. He didn't say anything at the time. He just chewed his ham, nodded politely, and filed the comment away in a mental folder marked with a single word: trouble. Elena had been there that night. She'd cleared the plates and overheard the conversation. Later, after Kenneth and Patricia left, Arthur found her in the kitchen standing very still with her hands gripping the edge of the sink. She didn't cry. Elena was not a crying woman, but her knuckles were white. "I'll be leaving if that's what they want," she said quietly. "I won't cause you problems with your family." Arthur pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down heavily. "Elena," he said, "you have been more family to me in 9 years than that boy has been in 20. You're not going anywhere." But here's the thing about family fights over land and money. They don't stay contained. They spread like kudzu, choking out everything they touch until nothing is left but the fight itself. Kenneth started calling more frequently after the lawyer visit. At first he was casual, asking about Arthur's health, pretending he just wanted to check in. Then the questions sharpened. Had Arthur been to the doctor lately? Had anyone new been spending time at the house? Had Arthur signed any documents he hadn't mentioned to Kenneth? The questions were careful enough to seem innocent, but pointed enough that Arthur recognized them for what they were. A paper trail. Kenneth was building one. Every conversation, every perceived slip in Arthur's memory, every mention of Alina's presence in the house was being recorded in a notebook or a phone memo or a letter to a lawyer. All of it ammunition for an argument Arthur recognized from the articles he'd been reading. Diminished capacity, undue influence, caregiver isolation. The law in most states gives adult children exactly zero automatic right to their parents' money. You can disinherit your children entirely, for any reason or no reason at all, and in 48 states, they have no legal standing to object unless they can prove you were not in your right mind when you did it. That is the door Kenneth intended to walk through. If he could demonstrate that Arthur was confused or dependent or unduly influenced by the woman who cooked his meals and drove him to his appointments, he could have whatever will Arthur left behind thrown out. And then the estate would revert to the default rules of intestacy, which in Kentucky means everything goes to the closest living relative, namely one Kenneth Bellingham. Patricia was the strategist. She'd done the real research. She'd found cases in the county where adult children successfully contested wills on exactly these grounds. She'd learned the magic phrases, fiduciary duty, confidential relationship, unnatural disposition. She'd prepared a timeline on paper showing Alina's gradual takeover of Arthur's daily life, framing it not as devotion, but as a deliberate campaign of isolation. The fact that Alina had never asked for money, had never been made a beneficiary of anything, didn't appear in Patricia's timeline. That part inconveniently suggested that Alina was exactly what she appeared to be, a decent woman doing a job she cared about. Arthur, meanwhile, had been quietly doing his own preparation. He'd spoken to a lawyer named Harold Travis, a man in his 60s who specialized in agricultural estate planning and had seen every variety of family greed the state of Kentucky could produce. Harold was not flashy. He drove a pickup, wore bolo ties, and kept a revolver in his desk drawer, which he would show you only if the conversation turned to inheritance disputes and your name happened to be in the room. Arthur and Harold met 4 times over the course of 6 months. They discussed the land, the herd, the mineral rights that nobody in the family had thought about in 2 generations, but that had recently become worth something because of a natural gas survey. They discussed Alina and her unpaid overtime, and the fact that she had nursed Arthur through a bout of pneumonia 2 winters ago without ever once calling Kenneth to say your father might be dying. They discussed what it would mean for the farm to stay a farm, not a subdivision, and whose hands it could be trusted in. And then Arthur signed a set of documents that he placed in the fireproof safe and told no living soul about except Harold and Alina, who didn't read them because Arthur asked her not to, and she trusted him completely. The conflict reached its boiling point on a Thursday morning in late September when Kenneth arrived at the farm unannounced with Douglas Creech at his side and a formal letter in his hand. The letter stated that Kenneth had serious concerns about his father's mental fitness and was requesting a formal competency evaluation, and that during the evaluation period, he believed it would be in Arthur's best interest to grant Kenneth power of attorney over all financial and medical decisions. Arthur read the letter on the front porch, chewing a piece of hay, while Alina stood in the doorway and Kenneth and the lawyer waited on the gravel drive like 2 men expecting a house to collapse. Arthur folded the letter carefully. He looked at his son. He looked at the lawyer. Then he said the words that would set everything that followed in motion. "Son, you've got exactly 1 chance to turn around and pretend this never happened. After that, the only thing you're gonna get from me is a piece of paper you can't contest." Kenneth Bellingham did not turn around. He laughed. Not the laugh of a man who found anything funny, but the laugh of someone who has already convinced himself he's holding the winning hand and wants you to know it. "Dad," he said, looking down at the folded letter still in Arthur's hand, "you can't just wish this away. The law exists for a reason, for when people stop thinking clearly." Douglas Creech, the lawyer, shifted his weight on the gravel drive. He'd seen family confrontations turn ugly before, but there was something in Arthur Bellingham's stillness that made him check his phone just to have somewhere else to look. Arthur unfolded the letter, held it up, and with the same hands that had pulled calves from cows and strung fence through Kentucky summers, he tore it cleanly in half. Then he tore it again. The pieces fluttered onto the porch boards. "The law," Arthur said quietly, "exists to protect people from vultures like you. I've got my own lawyer, my own doctor, and my own mind. None of those things require your signature, your permission, or your presence on my land. Elena, would you bring me the phone?" Elena disappeared into the house and returned a moment later with the cordless handset. Arthur dialed a number from memory, waited, and then spoke in a voice that had dropped its portiere softness and taken on the weight of someone who had spent decades negotiating with banks, suppliers, and men who thought they could cheat a farmer. "Harold, they're here." "Yes, now." He hung up. "You'll be hearing from my attorney within the hour," he said to Creech without looking at Kenneth. "I suggest you clear whatever you've got on your calendar, because the one thing I promise you is that this is not going the way you think." The lawyer's SUV kicked up dust as it left, but this was not a victory. It was the beginning of a legal war that would consume the next 18 months of everyone's lives, and the first shots were fired not by Arthur, but by Patricia Bellingham, the woman who had never spent a single night under her father-in-law's roof, but had already decided what that roof was worth. 3 days after the confrontation on the porch, Harold Travis received a formal petition for emergency guardianship from Douglas Creech's firm. The petition cited Kentucky Revised Statutes, Chapter 387, arguing that Arthur was an indigent and incapacitated person being manipulated by a domestic caretaker, Elena Massey, who has systematically isolated Mr. Bellingham from his natural family. The document ran 17 pages. It included a sworn affidavit from Kenneth stating that his father's cognitive decline had been obvious for years, that Arthur had become unreasonably dependent on Elena, and that the family believed she had already manipulated Arthur into changing his will. None of this was true, but truth is not what filings are made of. Filings are made of allegations, and allegations, once filed, have to be answered. Arthur's response, drafted by Harold, was a thing of beauty. It included letters from 3 physicians who had examined Arthur within the previous 6 months, each of whom attested in blunt medical language that Arthur Bellingham possessed cognitive faculties well above average for his age cohort, with no indication of dementia, confusion, or impairment in judgment. It included bank records showing that Elena had never received a single irregular payment, had never been made a signatory on any account, and had never had access to Arthur's financial documents. It included a notarized statement from Arthur himself, typed on a manual typewriter because he didn't trust computers, explaining in his own words exactly what he thought of his son's sudden concern for his well-being. That paragraph, Harold noted with professional delight, would not play well in a courtroom. But here's the thing about undue influence claims. The accusation itself is the weapon. Even if you disprove it, even if you demolish every factual claim the other side makes, the smell of it lingers, neighbors whisper, relatives choose sides. And for a woman like Elena Massey, who had spent 9 years building a quiet reputation in a tight rural community, the accusation that she had manipulated an old man for his money was a stain that didn't wash out just because a judge eventually dismissed the petition. The dismissal did come 6 weeks later, after a hearing in which the judge read Arthur's paragraph about his son aloud in open court. Kenneth did not attend. He claimed a work conflict. But the damage to Elena had already been done, and Patricia Bellingham knew it. She had lost the guardianship motion, but she had planted exactly the kind of community doubt that makes people look at a caregiver differently. That was the point. Patricia wasn't trying to win the first battle. She was laying siege. Arthur, meanwhile, had a larger problem than his son's legal maneuvering. The natural gas survey that had been conducted the previous year, the one nobody outside of Harold Travis's office knew about, had just come back with numbers that staggered even the surveyors. The Bellingham farm sat on a section of the New Albany Shale Formation that was now accessible with modern fracking technology. The mineral rights, which Arthur's grandfather had retained when he originally parceled out some adjacent acreage generations ago, were estimated at a conservative value of $11.7 million. That was the conservative figure. The high-end estimate, depending on natural gas prices and extraction costs, was nearly 3 times that. Suddenly, the 240 acres of pastureland weren't just a farm anymore. They were an energy asset. And the fight over Arthur Bellingham's estate was no longer a family squabble. It was a 9-figure inheritance war. Knowledge of the gas rights changed Kenneth's approach completely. The guardianship petition had been a probe, a test of Arthur's defenses. Now Kenneth, at Patricia's urging, hired a second law firm. This one specialized not in probate litigation, but in energy and mineral rights. They began filing to freeze Arthur's ability to sell or encumber the land while his competency was still under review. They subpoenaed Harold Travis's records. They demanded a full accounting of every interaction Alina had with Arthur, every errand, every meal, every drive to the doctor. The motion argued that any transfer of property to a non-family member, particularly a caregiver, must be presumed to be the result of undue influence under Kentucky common law principles that mirrored the California Probate Code's prohibition on caregiver beneficiary designations. The phrase, prohibited transferee, appeared 31 times in their brief. Arthur, sitting in Harold's office with the subpoena stack on the desk between them, looked at his lawyer and said, "They've got no idea what I've already done, do they?" Harold removed his bolo tie, polished his glasses, and replied, "No, Arthur, they don't. And if you'll let me time this right, the moment they find out is the moment their entire case falls apart." What Arthur had done, and what Harold had helped him structure over those 6 months of quiet meetings, was not a simple will. Wills can be contested. Trusts, particularly irrevocable trusts drafted with independent representation and multiple capacity certifications, are a fortress. Arthur had placed the farm and all its mineral rights into an irrevocable trust, naming Alina Massey as the trustee and the lifetime beneficiary, with the remainder to pass to a non-profit agricultural preservation society upon her death. The trust was funded. The deed had been recorded. The gas rights had been separately encumbered, such that any attempt to break the trust would trigger massive tax penalties and essentially render the assets unviable for development. Arthur had retained enough for his own care, but the bulk of the estate, the part Kenneth had been counting on, was already beyond reach. And because the trust had been executed 6 months before Kenneth's guardianship petition, and because it had been reviewed by 2 separate independent counsel who had each verified Arthur's capacity at length, the legal presumption of undue influence was essentially impossible to prove. The caregiver rule that Patricia's lawyers had been counting on. It didn't apply when the caregiver was not the beneficiary of a will, but rather the trustee of a document that had been drafted with such rigorous protections that no court in its right mind would pierce it. But Harold chose not to reveal the trust's existence yet. He let Kenneth's legal team spend money on motions and discovery and depositions. He let them burn through their retainer while Arthur's quiet, immovable patience stretched out across the months like a tarp over hay. Arthur went to his doctor's appointments. Alina drove him. The town watched. The major pivot came on a grey Tuesday morning in early February when Arthur coughed during breakfast, and the cough did not stop. Alina insisted on driving him to the emergency room, and by that evening, the diagnosis was in. Stage 4 lung cancer, aggressive, metastasized. Arthur had never smoked a cigarette in his life, but the farm had used asbestos insulation in the old barn decades ago, and these things happen without anyone's permission. The doctors gave him 3 to 6 months. Arthur received the news with the same calm he'd shown on the porch. He looked at Alina, whose face had gone pale and wet, and said, "Well, that simplifies the calendar." Kenneth learned of his father's diagnosis within 48 hours, and then he did something that even Douglas Creech later admitted was a mistake. He accelerated. He filed an emergency motion to freeze all assets immediately, arguing that Arthur's terminal illness created a window of vulnerability in which Alina could coerce the old man into last-minute changes. The motion was heard before a different judge, one who hadn't been involved in the earlier guardianship case, and to Harold's genuine shock, the judge granted a temporary restraining order on all asset transfers pending a full evidentiary hearing. Arthur's accounts were frozen. Elena, who depended on the small weekly reimbursement for groceries and medical supplies, suddenly had no money to keep the household running except her own modest savings, which she spent without telling Arthur because she knew he'd be furious, and she couldn't bear to watch him worry about something as small as money when his body was already losing ground. But the real damage was to Elena's spirit. The restraining order felt to her like a public judgment. It felt like the court had looked at her and seen what Patricia had been painting all along, a woman who took advantage of a vulnerable old man. She stopped answering her phone. She stopped going to church. She stayed at the farm because Arthur needed her, but something in her had curled inward, and the light that had sustained her for 9 years was dimming. Arthur noticed. He watched her move through the house with her shoulders tight and her voice flat, and one evening, when the pain medication had eased him enough to speak clearly, he called her into his room. "Elena," he said, "close the door and sit down. There's something you need to know that you don't know yet, and I need you to help me make sure it lands exactly right." The evidentiary hearing was set for March 15th. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, smelling of old paper and institutional resolve. Kenneth arrived in a suit Patricia had chosen, accompanied by both legal teams. Patricia herself sat in the gallery in a navy dress that looked appropriate for a funeral. Elena sat in the back row, holding a manila envelope that Arthur had given her that morning with instructions not to open it until Harold told her to. Arthur did not attend. He was at home, in a hospital bed that Elena had arranged to be delivered, breathing oxygen from a tank, watching the clock on his wall. But Harold stood before the judge with a stack of documents and a clear, unhurried voice. He informed the court that the respondent, Arthur Bellingham, had a pre-existing irrevocable trust that had been executed 8 months prior, that the trust had been reviewed by 2 independent attorneys, that the grantor's capacity had been thoroughly documented, and that the frozen assets were not actually within Arthur's direct control to transfer because they had already been transferred. The judge asked to see the trust documents. Harold handed them over. He also handed over a sworn statement from Arthur Bellingham, dated that very morning, notarized by a mobile notary who had come to the farm, in which Arthur requested that the court dissolve the restraining order, dismiss all pending motions, and permit Elena Massey to administer the trust without interference. And then Harold did something that silenced the room. He turned toward the gallery. "Your Honor," he said, "I request that Mrs. Elena Massey approach the bench. She's carrying a document that the grantor directed her to bring." Elena stood, walked forward, her legs unsteady. She handed the envelope to Harold with trembling hands. Harold opened it, read the single sheet inside, and then, with the faintest crack in his professional composure, passed it to the judge. The judge read it. She looked at Elena. She looked at Kenneth. Then she read the contents of that letter aloud, and the words Arthur Bellingham had written on his deathbed changed everything. But before we get to those words, you need to understand one more thing about the woman who cooked his meals and never asked for anything. Because what Elena had been hiding, even from Arthur, was the one piece of this story that would prove exactly why some old men choose outsiders over blood. Elena Massey had been hiding something, not a scheme, not a manipulation. The opposite. 18 months earlier, long before the gas survey numbers came back and before Kenneth ever hired his first lawyer, Patricia Bellingham had driven out to the farm alone. She arrived in a black sedan with a leather folder and a proposition. She told Elena that Arthur's situation was unsustainable, that a woman of Elena's age shouldn't be burdened with an old man's care, and that the family was prepared to offer her a very generous severance package if she would simply resign and relocate. $50,000, a clean reference, a moving service. All she had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and leave within the week. Patricia had been smooth, practiced, smiling with her mouth while her eyes inventoried every piece of furniture in the farmhouse. Elena listened. She didn't interrupt. And then she said no, not a loud, righteous no, just a quiet refusal that came from somewhere deeper than Patricia could reach. "I'm not leaving him," she said, "and you can keep your money." What Elena never told Arthur, because she didn't want to burden him with the ugliness, was that Patricia hadn't stopped there. Over the following months, Patricia made phone calls to Elena's former employers, to her church, even to her adult daughter in Tennessee, implying that Elena might be taking financial advantage of an elderly man. Nothing actionable, nothing that could be proven in a defamation suit. Just the poison of suggestion dripped slowly into the same circles where Alina had built her quiet life. She'd endured it in silence because she believed that speaking up would only hurt Arthur more. She had protected him from his own family's cruelty, and she had done it without ever once asking him to repay the damage with gratitude or money or even acknowledgement. In the courtroom, Harold finished reading the judge's letter aloud. Arthur's words were simple. He outlined his medical history, his soundness of mind, and his gratitude toward Alina. Then he said this: "To my son Kenneth, I leave the sum of $1, payable upon proof that you have attended at least 3 consecutive family dinners without once mentioning my money. I doubt this will ever be collected. To my daughter-in-law Patricia, I leave my deep and sincere regret that she never learned the difference between ambition and decency. To Alina Massey, I leave my love, my gratitude, and the full and unencumbered administration of the trust that holds this farm and all its resources. Not because she asked, but because she earned it with years of doing what family is supposed to do, but never did. I have been rich in my life, not because of what was under the ground, but because one person sat beside me when she had every reason to walk away." Judge folded the letter. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Kenneth stood up, face pale except for 2 splotches of red high on his cheeks, and his voice cracked as he said, "This is a fraud. He was incoherent. She wrote that letter." Harold Travis calmly informed the court that the letter had been witnessed by a notary and a hospice nurse, both of whom were present in the hallway and available to testify. Patricia pulled her husband's sleeve, hissing something that the court reporter didn't capture. Kenneth wrenched his arm away. In the back row, Alina Massey finally let herself cry, not in victory, in exhaustion, in the release of 9 years of quiet sacrifice being seen aloud by a room full of strangers. The judge dissolved the restraining order and dismissed all pending motions with prejudice, which meant Kenneth's team had no path to refile. The irrevocable trust stood, the mineral rights were secure, and the Bellingham farm, all 240 acres of it, would never become a subdivision or a payday for the son who had only ever seen dirt as a prelude to a check. But hear what makes this story bigger than one courtroom victory. Because 3 days after the hearing, as Arthur lay in the farmhouse bed drifting in and out of consciousness, Douglas Creech, Kenneth's own lawyer, called Harold Travis with a piece of information that he'd struggled with ethically and finally decided he couldn't keep silent about any longer. Kenneth Bellingham was in debt, not the manageable kind. The catastrophic, hidden from his wife, second mortgage without her knowledge kind. He'd been counting on his inheritance to cover nearly $400,000 in bad real estate bets, investments he'd made with money that wasn't entirely his. Patricia didn't know. The lawyers on the energy rights side didn't know. But Creech had pieced it together when Kenneth had failed to pay his legal bills and then asked for an extension, citing a temporary liquidity issue. Creech, who had been a party to the petition that painted Alina as the exploiter, realized with creeping horror that the actual financial predator in this story was his own client. The man who had accused a caregiver of undue influence was the one trying to extract money under false pretenses. Harold took this information to Alina because Alina was now the trustee. She had the authority to make decisions about the estate's legal position. And Alina, sitting at Arthur's kitchen table with the same hands that had peeled potatoes and sorted pills, made a decision that Arthur would have approved. She told Harold not to pursue Kenneth for abuse of process, not to seek sanctions, not to publicly humiliate him. "That boy is going to lose everything soon enough on his own," she said. "I won't be the one who pushes. Arthur wouldn't want that." Arthur died 6 weeks later, on a warm April afternoon with the windows open and the sound of birds in the pasture. Alina was holding his hand. Kenneth was not there. He stopped answering calls from Douglas Creech, from Patricia, even from the hospice nurse who had tried to reach him twice. Later, they learned he had been in Louisville, attempting to negotiate a personal bankruptcy that he still hadn't told his wife about. The son who had tried to seize a fortune had been running from his own collapse, while the woman he painted as a predator held a dying man's hand and asked for nothing but the privilege of being there. But there's one more turn in this story, one that nobody saw coming, because the gas rights that Arthur had placed in the trust weren't just valuable, They were about to become the center of a custody battle of a different kind. A multinational energy corporation had been monitoring the legal situation, waiting to see whether the trust would survive. Once the ruling came down, they approached Elena with an offer, a lease on the mineral rights that would pay the trust a royalty of $1.2 million per year, escalating with production, with a signing bonus of $3 million up front. All of it going into the trust, not to Elena personally. She would remain a caretaker on paper, compensated at a reasonable rate, while the bulk of the money would fund the agricultural preservation non-profit that Arthur had named. The farm would stay a farm, the land would stay whole, and the woman who had been called a prohibited transferee, a manipulator, a threat to an old man's legacy, would become the steward of a conservation program that would keep hundreds of acres of Kentucky pastureland intact for generations. Kenneth Bellingham sued to challenge the trust one last time, arguing that the energy company's offer proved the estate was undervalued at the time of the trust's creation. The case was dismissed in summary judgment. Patricia left him 6 months later, taking what little remained and moving to her sister in Ohio. Kenneth now lives in a one-bedroom apartment in Elizabethtown, working as a property appraiser for a firm that doesn't know his full history. The last legal document he ever filed was his own bankruptcy petition. The dollar Arthur left him, as far as Harold Travis can determine, it was never claimed. And Elena, she still lives on the farm. She still cooks her own meals, still drives herself to appointments, still has never asked for anything beyond what Arthur freely gave her. When the first royalty check arrived, she used part of it to repair the barn that had been sagging since the 90s. She didn't touch the rest. She never will. That's not why she stayed. What Elena did with the rest of the money, the part that didn't go toward the barn or the farm's daily operations, is the thing nobody saw coming. Not Harold, not the energy company, certainly not Kenneth, who by that point had stopped reading any mail that didn't come from a collection agency. Arthur Bellingham's trust contained a clause that even Harold Travis had forgotten about until Elena quietly asked him to review it one October morning, 2 years after Arthur's death. The clause stated that any royalties above the amount needed to maintain the farm and compensate the trustee at a reasonable rate would be directed into a scholarship fund for agricultural education. Not a generic one. A scholarship specifically for the grandchildren of Arthur Bellingham, provided they wished to study farming, land management, or conservation. At the time Arthur wrote that clause, he had exactly one grandchild, a girl named Callie, Kenneth's daughter from his first marriage, who had been 15 when her father remarried Patricia and moved to Louisville. Callie had stopped visiting the farm shortly after that, not because she didn't love her grandfather, but because Patricia had made it clear that weekend visits to the old man's property were not a priority. Callie was now 23, living in Nashville, working at a coffee shop, and carrying a quiet, unspoken grief that she'd never gotten to say goodbye to the one person in her family who had ever looked at her like she mattered. Elena found Callie through a mutual acquaintance, a woman from the church who still kept in touch with Kenneth's ex-wife. She didn't call the ex-wife, she called Callie directly. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Callie cried. Elena cried. By the end of it, a young woman who had been effectively disinherited from her own grandfather's legacy, not by law, but by the emotional sabotage of the adults around her, learned that Arthur had been thinking of her all along. The scholarship was real and fully funded. Callie could attend any agricultural program she wanted, and the trust would cover tuition, housing, and a modest living stipend, plus an internship on the Bellingham farm if she wanted it. She wanted it. She enrolled at the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture that spring. Elena prepared the old guest room that had stood empty since Arthur died. Now here is the part of the story that cuts closest to the bone, and the reason I'm telling you this is not just because it's satisfying, but because it reveals something that most inheritance stories miss entirely. Kenneth Bellingham found out about the scholarship when Callie posted a photo on social media of herself standing beside Elena in front of the repaired barn, holding a letter from the university. The caption read, "Starting over, thanks to the 2 people who never gave up on me." Grandpa Arthur, I hope you're watching. Kenneth saw it. He called Callie for the first time in 2 years, not to congratulate her, to demand to know why she was on the farm, who had given her permission, and what exactly Elena Massey was getting out of it. Callie listened to her father's voice rise to the familiar pitch of financial panic, and then she said something that Arthur would have recognized instantly as his own bloodline speaking. "Dad, this isn't about you. It never was. I'll be fine." "I hope you find a way to be fine too." She hung up. She didn't block his number, but she didn't answer the next 6 calls either. The girl who had been exiled from the farm by her stepmother's ambition had just reclaimed it, not through litigation or inheritance, but through the quiet mechanisms of a trust written by a man who understood that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's a structure that outlasts the enemy's ability to complain about it. Patricia, meanwhile, had moved on in the way that people like Patricia move on. She remarried within 18 months, this time to a dentist in Cincinnati who owned a chain of urgent care clinics. The marriage lasted less than a year. Harold Travis, who kept tabs on these things with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has seen justice work slowly, learned from a contact in the county that Patricia had attempted to claim a portion of the dental practice's assets in the divorce and had been denied because the prenuptial agreement was ironclad. She now lives in a condominium in northern Kentucky, working as a property manager and telling anyone who will listen a version of the Bellingham story in which she was the victim of a cruel old man and a manipulative housekeeper. Nobody listens for long. The condo association fined her twice for leaving her trash cans out beyond the permitted window. But I want to bring us back to Elena, because the most important turn in this story happened not in a courtroom or a bank, but on a Sunday evening in late summer when she sat down at the kitchen table with Callie and a shoebox. The shoebox contained letters, not legal documents. Personal letters from Arthur to Elena, written over the final 6 months of his life, when he knew he was dying but hadn't yet told anyone except Harold and his doctors. He'd given them to Elena with instructions not to open the box until after his death and the resolution of any legal challenges. Elena had waited. She'd waited through the guardianship petition, the asset freeze, the courtroom showdown, the dissolution of the restraining order, and the long quiet months after Arthur passed. Then one Sunday she opened the box. There were 11 letters. They were not love letters, at least not in the romantic sense. They were gratitude letters. Each one described a specific moment from the 9 years Elena had spent caring for Arthur, moments so small and particular that only a man who was paying the closest possible attention would have remembered them. The time she'd stayed up all night with a sick calf because Arthur was too weak to do it himself, and she didn't want him to worry. The afternoon she'd driven 3 hours to pick up a specific part for the tractor and hadn't complained once. The Christmas she'd decorated the entire house by herself because Kenneth and Patricia had cancelled at the last minute, and she'd sat with Arthur eating ham and telling stories about her own childhood on a farm in Indiana that had been sold when her father died, and she'd never quite gotten over it. That detail, Elena's secret heartbreak about a lost family farm, was the key to everything Arthur had done. In the final letter, Arthur wrote, "Elena, you never told me you grew up on land like this. You never told me your father lost his farm to a bank when you were 19, and you watched him die a few years later with nothing to show for it. You never told me any of that because you don't talk about yourself, which is why I had to ask around and piece it together from the pastor and your daughter. I'm not leaving you this farm to be kind. I'm leaving it because you are the only person within 100 miles who understands what it means to lose one. You will never lose this one. What I want you to do with it, besides whatever you want, is to help Callie and any grandchild who comes after her understand that land is not a bank account. It's a pact between the living and the dead, and the only people who should be in charge of it are the ones who don't see a dollar sign when they look at a pasture." Callie read that letter out loud at the kitchen table while Elena held her coffee mug with both hands and let the tears fall without wiping them. The next morning, Callie went to the barn and began learning how to care for the herd. She didn't know anything about cattle. She didn't need to. Elena knew. And Elena, the woman who had been called a prohibited transferee and a manipulator and a threat to the Bellingham family, began teaching the granddaughter of the man she'd loved like a father how to carry forward the only inheritance that cannot be contested, knowledge of the land passed hand to hand. The final surprise, the one that even Harold Travis learned only when the paperwork crossed his desk 3 years later, was this. Elena Massey, who had never been a blood relative and had never once asked for an ownership stake, amended the trust to name Callie Bellingham as the future trustee upon Alina's death or incapacity. She didn't have to. Arthur's trust gave her full discretion. But she did it because she believed, with the same quiet certainty that had guided her through every crisis, that the farm belonged not to any individual but to the people who would actually care for it. Callie, at 26, became the legal successor to an estate worth, by that point, somewhere north of $18 million. Kenneth Bellingham, when he learned of this through a legal notification he had a statutory right to receive as a lineal descendant, sent a letter to the trustee. A physical letter, typed, demanding that the amendment be reversed. Alina filed it in the same drawer where she kept Arthur's old letters, unopened. The Bellingham farm endures. The land remains whole. The mineral royalties fund a small agricultural education program that now supports 4 students a year, 2 of them from families who have never owned land and never expected to. And every Sunday evening, Callie and Alina eat dinner at the same table where Arthur once sat, looking out the window at the pasture he never stopped loving. Some families pass down money, some pass down grudges. Arthur Bellingham passed down the one thing that can survive any legal challenge, any greedy child, and any amount of time. He passed down a story about what it actually means to be family. Here is what I hope you carry with you from Arthur Bellingham's story. The law has a phrase for what Patricia tried to pin on Alina Massey: undue influence. It exists because there are people in this world who will exploit the old, the sick, the lonely, and anyone whose signature is worth more than their handshake. And every single year, elder financial abuse drains more than $28 billion from the people who should be protected most. The cruelest part. Nearly 60% of that abuse is committed by family members. Sons, daughters, nieces and nephews, people who share last names and holiday tables and who have convinced themselves that love is a ledger and they are owed a balance. The caregiver, the outsider, the one who shows up and stays, almost never makes the complaint. They're too busy doing the work. But the law, in its blunt attempt to protect, sometimes renders them suspects first and saints only after a courtroom says so. That is the upside-down reality Arthur understood. He built his trust not just to shield his land, but to flip that presumption on its head. He made sure the person who loved him without asking was treated as exactly what she was: worthy, not suspect. So here is the question I want you to sit with tonight. Not whether you have your own Arthur Bellingham in your life, but whether you have become the kind of person who would recognize one. The quiet ones, the ones who don't campaign for your attention or itemize their affection. Would you see them? Would you protect them from the people who will inevitably try to paint their loyalty as a scheme? Because inheritance fights are not really about money. They are about the stories families tell themselves about who is inside the circle and who will never be let in. Arthur rewrote that story while he still had the pen. Most of us wait until someone else is holding it. This channel is built entirely on the belief that those stories deserve to be told. The ones that don't make the local paper but change everything for the people inside them. If you want these stories to keep showing up in your feed, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment. You have no idea how much that small act matters to us. The algorithm rewards engagement, but so does the hope that the right story lands in front of someone who needs it tonight. Maybe you're an Alina, maybe you're a Callie, trying to find your way back to a legacy that got stolen by adult nonsense. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. The quiet ones see you, and so do we.